Welcome to the Hodja on Architecture podcast, The Architecture of Experience, Chapter 4, The Myth of Average, Designing Beyond the Standard Human. In the previous chapter, we examined how architecture translates the body's complexity into systems of measurement. We explored how anthropometric standards, ergonomic guidelines, and statistical data provide design with structure, consistency, and control, while simultaneously reducing lived experience into measurable categories. Yet within that process lies a deeper assumption that often goes unquestioned. Most ergonomic systems are built around the idea of the average human, a figure that can stand in for the diversity of real bodies. In this chapter, we will examine how this apparently neutral concept became one of the most influential assumptions in modern design, and why its simplicity conceals a far more complicated reality. The idea of the average emerged from a desire to make complexity manageable. Human bodies vary enormously across age, gender, ability, culture, and physical condition, and without some form of simplification, large-scale design systems would become almost impossible to coordinate. Statistical averages offered a solution. By collecting measurements across populations and identifying common ranges, designers could establish standards that would function for the majority of users. This approach allowed architecture, industry, and manufacturing to operate with efficiency and predictability, transforming human variability into something that could be systematized. At first glance, this appears entirely reasonable. A staircase cannot be redesigned for every individual who uses it, nor can a chair be custom-built for each body. Design requires generalization to function. Standards make buildings safer, products more accessible, and environments more consistent. Without them, architecture would struggle to move beyond isolated and highly specific solutions. The problem, however, is not that averages exist, but that they gradually begin to appear natural and objective rather than constructed and selective. The average human is not a person. It is statistical fiction that compresses variation into a single representative figure. Yet once this abstraction enters design culture, it begins to shape the built environment as though it were a neutral reality. Door heights, counter levels, circulation widths, seating dimensions, and countless other spatial conditions are calibrated around assumptions about what bodies are expected to do. These assumptions often become invisible because they are embedded so deeply within standards that they appear unquestionable. What makes this particularly significant is that averages do not merely describe bodies. They privilege certain bodies over others. Every standard implicitly defines who is considered normal and who is considered deviant. A dimension that works comfortably for one person may produce difficulty or exclusion for another. A staircase designed around a standard stride may become exhausting for an elderly user. A countertop calibrated to an assumed height may be inaccessible for someone using a wheelchair. Even spaces that technically comply with accessibility regulations can still privilege certain bodily experiences while marginalizing others. This reveals an important contradiction within modern design thinking. Standardization promises universality, yet it often produces exclusion precisely because it treats diversity as something secondary. The more architecture depends on singular averages, the more it risks misunderstanding the plurality of human experience. Real bodies do not exist as stable categories. They change over time, fluctuate with fatigue, adapt through habit, and interact with environments differently depending on context. Designing as though a single model could adequately represent all of these conditions inevitably simplifies reality. At the same time, the issue extends beyond physical dimensions alone. The standard human is not only a bodily construct, but also a cultural one. Many historical ergonomic datasets were collected in limited demographic contexts, often based on relatively homogeneous adult populations from specific regions or cultures. The resulting standards were then exported globally as though they represented universal truths. In practice, however, bodies are shaped by nutrition, environment, labor conditions, social behavior, and cultural expectations. What appears neutral within one context may become inappropriate within another. This becomes especially evident when architecture crosses cultures. A seating arrangement designed around one pattern of social interaction may feel awkward elsewhere. Spatial distances that appear comfortable within one society may feel intrusive or excessively detached within another. Even concepts of privacy, movement, and bodily proximity differ significantly between cultures. The body is therefore not only biological but also social and cultural. Reducing it to a universal average ignores how experience itself is conditioned by context. These limitations have led many contemporary designers to reconsider the relationship between standardization and inclusivity. Rather than treating variation as a problem to be minimized, There is an increasing recognition that diversity itself should become a starting point for design thinking. This does not mean abandoning standards altogether, but questioning how they are used and what assumptions they carry. The goal is no longer to identify a perfect average, but to create systems that accommodate differences more flexibly. This shift is particularly evident in discussions surrounding inclusive and universal design. Instead of asking how most people will use a space, designers increasingly ask how a broader range of bodies and abilities can be supported simultaneously. This significantly changes the role of ergonomics. It moves away from optimizing for an ideal body and towards negotiating between multiple forms of bodily experience. In doing so, ergonomics becomes less about fixing dimensions and more about creating adaptability. Adaptability, however, introduces its own challenges. The more architecture attempts to respond to diverse needs, the more complex design decisions become. Flexibility requires space, resources, and careful consideration. There is no longer a single correct solution that can be applied universally. Instead, design becomes a process of balancing competing conditions and acknowledging that no environment can perfectly satisfy everybody at all times. This may appear less efficient, but it is arguably more honest. It accepts that human experience cannot be fully compressed into stable categories. Importantly, this shift also transforms how we think about design responsibility. If architecture shapes bodily experience, then the bodies included within design systems matter profoundly. Decisions that appear purely technical often carry ethical consequences. A dimension is never just a dimension. It reflects assumptions about who belongs in space and who must adapt to fit. The politics of inclusion are therefore embedded not only in policies and regulations but also in everyday spatial decisions that often go unnoticed. Recognizing this does not require architecture to abandon measurement, but it does require a more critical relationship with it. Standards should not be treated as unquestionable truths, but as tools that must remain open to revision and contextual interpretation. The average can still function as a reference point, but it cannot become the definition of humanity itself. Once it does, architecture risks designing not for people as they are, but for an imagined figure that exists primarily within statistical systems. In many ways, the myth of average persists because it offers comfort. It simplifies uncertainty and provides designers with the reassuring sense that human complexity can be controlled through data. Yet lived experience constantly exceeds these systems. Bodies age, adapt, differ, and behave unpredictably. Space is encountered differently depending on emotion, culture, ability, and circumstance. The more carefully we observe how people actually inhabit environments, the more unstable the idea of a standard human begins to appear. In this chapter, we have examined how the concept of the average became central to ergonomic thinking and how it continues to shape architectural space in often invisible ways. We have seen that averages are not neutral reflections of reality, but constructed tools that simplify complexity while inevitably excluding aspects of it. More importantly, we have begun to understand that designing beyond the standard human does not mean rejecting standards entirely, but recognizing that no single body can ever fully represent the diversity of human experience. In the next chapter, we will move from the politics of standardization to the invisible spatial relationships that shape everyday interaction. We will examine how bodies negotiate distance, proximity, and personal territory within space, and how these subtle dynamics influence perception and behavior far more than we often realize. The discussion will shift from averages to relationships, from dimensions to interaction. Because once architecture begins to engage with multiple bodies rather than a single ideal one, the next question becomes unavoidable. How do bodies relate to one another within space? This concludes Chapter 4 of The Architecture of Experience, The Myth of Average, Designing Beyond the Standard Human. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.